We're incredibly grateful for your support. Before we begin today's tale, tell us, which city or country are you joining us from? We love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Shattered Reflections. Neil Reeves stood frozen in the doorway of his home, the words he'd just overheard replaying in his mind like a twisted record. Wear the red dress. He always liked that color on you, his 17-year-old daughter Amber had whispered to his wife, Meredith. 15 years of marriage crystallized into this single, devastating moment. Neil had returned early from his business trip, hoping to surprise his family. Instead, he was the one receiving the surprise, a knife to the heart, twisted by the two people he cherished most. Neil had built his life around them. At 42, he was a regional sales director at Pinnacle Industries, a position earned through relentless dedication. He'd sacrificed countless evenings and weekends to provide the sprawling suburban house with the wraparound porch Meredith had always wanted, the private school education for Amber, the summer vacations to Europe. And now they were setting up his wife with his boss, Preston Walsh. Neil's mind flashed back to the company Christmas party 3 months ago. Preston's lingering gaze on Meredith, the way they'd laughed too intimately at inside jokes. Neil had dismissed his discomfort then, attributing it to his own insecurities. How naive he'd been. When is he picking you up? Amber asked, excitement bubbling in her voice. 7. Your father's flight doesn't land until tomorrow afternoon, Meredith replied, studying her reflection in the mirror. Preston's taking me to Bellissimo. I've always wanted to go there. Neil had taken Meredith to Bellissimo for their 10th anniversary. The memory soured instantly. Dad never takes you anywhere nice anymore, Amber said, her tone dismissive of the man who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd stayed up countless nights helping with science projects. Preston understands what a woman needs, Meredith said, reaching for her perfume, the one Neil had given her last Christmas. Your father is reliable, but there's more to life than reliability. Neil silently backed away, his chest tight with rage and betrayal. He retreated his car, mind racing. The revelation wasn't just about an affair. It was about his daughter actively participating in destroying their family. As Neil drove aimlessly through the streets of Oak Ridge, the town he'd called home for a decade, his phone buzzed with a text from Preston. Looking forward to our strategy meeting Monday. Good work on the Donovan account. Strategy meeting. The hypocrite. The same man who'd given speeches about company loyalty was betraying Neil behind his back. The man Neil had respected, even admired, was planning to dine with his wife tonight at Bellissimo. Neil pulled into the parking lot of River's Edge, a bar on the outskirts of town where no one from his social circle would recognize him. There, in a dimly lit corner booth, he ordered a whiskey and began to plan. Not just a reaction, but a calculated response. This betrayal would not stand. His phone buzzed again. Meredith, flight still on time for tomorrow? Should I pick you up? Neil stared at the message, at the casual deception. The woman who had promised to love him forever was counting on his absence to be with another man. His daughter, his flesh and blood, was encouraging it. Another, Neil told the bartender, pushing his empty glass forward. As the amber liquid filled the glass, Neil made his decision. He wouldn't confront them tonight, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him hurt. No, Neil Reeves would disappear, and when he returned, it wouldn't be as the reliable, predictable man they took for granted. He would return as their reckoning. Chapter 2. The Architect of Absence. By morning, Neil had formulated the first phase of his plan. He'd spent the night at the Oak Ridge Inn, a nondescript motel off the highway. Sleep had evaded him as his mind constructed and discarded scenarios, each more elaborate than the last. By dawn, clarity had emerged from chaos. Neil returned home shortly after Amber left for school, finding Meredith in the kitchen preparing breakfast. She startled at his appearance. Neil, what are you? I thought your flight wasn't until tonight. Panic flickered across her face, quickly masked by a practiced smile. Change of plans, Neil said, studying her carefully. The red dress was nowhere to be seen, likely hidden away like her betrayal. Conference wrapped early. You should have called, Meredith said, her voice straining for normalcy. I would have picked you up. I wanted to surprise you, Neil replied, the irony bitter on his tongue. Meredith busied herself with breakfast, her movements unnaturally precise. How was Chicago? Illuminating, Neil answered truthfully. He accepted the coffee she offered, watching her over the rim. 15 years together, and he was seeing her for the first time, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she avoided his eyes. How was your evening? Quiet, she lied smoothly. Just stayed in with Amber. Watched a movie. Neil nodded, allowing the lie to settle between them. I need to go into the office today. Something came up with the Donovan account. Relief visibly washed over Meredith. Of course. Will you be home for dinner? Don't count on it, Neil said, finishing his coffee. At Pinnacle Industries, Neil moved with purpose. First to HR, where he submitted his resignation, effective immediately. The HR director, Bonnie Taylor, couldn't hide her shock. 2 weeks' notice is standard, Mr. Reeves, she stammered. I'm aware, Neil replied, sliding an envelope across her desk. Inside you'll find documentation of all my current projects and contact information for my clients. My team is well prepared to continue without me. Next, Neil went to his office, packing only personal items. A photo of Amber as a child before she'd learned to betray. His degree, awards he'd earned through dedication to a company now tainted by Preston's actions. Neil's assistant, Harper Wilson, watched in bewilderment. Mr. Reeves, is everything okay? Change of direction, Harper, Neil replied, handing her a reference letter he'd prepared overnight. You've been exceptional. Any company would be lucky to have you. His final stop was the office of Samuel Bennett, Pinnacle's CFO and Neil's closest ally in the company. Samuel's face grew grave as Neil explained his departure. A sanitized version, professional and vague. This is about Preston, isn't it? Samuel asked, closing his office door. Neil paused. What makes you say that? Samuel sighed, removing his glasses. The board meeting last month. Preston pushed hard against your promotion. Said you weren't executive material. I fought for you, but Preston gets what Preston wants. Neil finished, pieces falling into place. His boss hadn't just coveted his wife. He'd actively sabotaged Neil's career. Where will you go? Samuel asked. I have opportunities, Neil said vaguely. Keep in touch, Samuel. The business world is smaller than we think. By noon, Neil had cleared out his office, said his goodbyes, and walked away from 15 years of career building. He drove directly to Oak Ridge First National, where he withdrew a significant portion of their savings, enough to sustain him, not enough to alert Meredith immediately. Neil's final stop was at the office of Vincent Mercer, an attorney known for his ruthless approach to divorce. Vincent's reputation preceded him. He didn't just win cases, he decimated opponents. I need information, not action, Neil clarified after explaining his situation. What would happen if I simply disappeared for a while? Vincent considered this. Abandonment can be grounds for divorce, but it works against you in settlement negotiations. I'm not concerned about settlements, Neil said. I want to understand my options without showing my hand. As Neil left Vincent's office, his phone buzzed with messages from Meredith, asking about dinner plans. From Preston, inquiring about his absence. Both acting as if their duplicity wasn't ripping apart the fabric of Neil's existence. Neil texted Meredith, work emergency. Don't wait up. To Preston, personal matter. We'll discuss Monday. Neither deserved more than that. Back at the Oak Ridge Inn, Neil booked a room for another night and began researching destinations. Not vacation spots, but places to reset, to transform. Places where Neil Reeves, the reliable husband and dedicated employee, could die, and someone else could emerge from the ashes. Chapter 3, Vanishing Point. Saturday morning arrived with a torrential downpour that matched Neil's mood. He'd spent the night reviewing financial statements, property deeds, insurance policies, mapping the interconnected details of his life with Meredith. Their financial entanglements were complex, but not impenetrable. Neil had always managed their investments. Meredith had little interest beyond knowing they were secure. Neil checked out of the Oak Ridge Inn at precisely 10 a.m. and drove to the private airfield 30 miles outside town. There, a small chartered plane awaited, not for Chicago, as he'd told Meredith, but for Key West, a temporary haven where he could plan without interference. Before boarding, Neil sent a text to Meredith. Flight delayed due to weather. We'll update when I land. His next call was to Lucas Murray, his college roommate turned cybersecurity specialist. Their friendship had endured despite infrequent contact, sustained by a bond forged in their youth. I need to become a ghost, Neil explained after brief pleasantries. Not permanently, but enough to move freely for a while. Lucas didn't ask why. Their friendship had always included an unspoken agreement. Support first, questions later. I can help with digital tracks. The rest is on you. By the time Neil's plane took off, Lucas had begun the process of obscuring Neil's digital footprint, not erasing it, which would raise flags, but muddying it enough to create confusion. During the flight, Neil received a call from Amber. He hesitated before answering, steeling himself against the affection he still felt for his daughter, despite her betrayal. "Dad? Mom's freaking out because you're not answering her texts," Amber said, her voice carrying the casual dismissiveness of adolescence. "I'm busy, Amber," Neil replied coolly. "Tell your mother I'll call when I can." "Whatever," Amber sighed. "When are you coming home? Preston's coming over for dinner tonight, and Mom's making a big deal about you two finally getting to know each other outside work." The audacity stunned Neil into momentary silence. Preston at his dinner table, in his home, while he was supposedly away. "Dad, are you there?" "Tell your mother I'll be delayed," Neil finally managed, his voice controlled despite the rage building inside him. Business complications. After landing in Key West, Neil checked into an anonymous beachfront rental under a name provided by Lucas. The small house offered privacy and a view of the ocean that should have been calming, but only reflected the turbulence within him. Neil spent the next 3 days in planning. He created spreadsheets detailing assets, compiled evidence of his contributions to their marriage, and most importantly, crafted the architecture of his disappearance. Not a permanent vanishing. That would be surrender, but a strategic retreat to gather strength for the battle ahead. On Wednesday, Neil called Meredith. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice a mix of anger and what sounded like genuine concern. "It's been days, Neil. Amber and I have been worried sick." "I doubt that," Neil replied, his tone measured. "I've decided to take some time away." "What are you talking about?" "You have responsibilities here, like hosting Preston for dinner at our home." Neil interrupted. "I resigned from Pinnacle on Monday. I'm sure Preston has already replaced me." Silence stretched between them. When Meredith spoke again, her voice had changed, became guarded. "Neil, whatever you think is happening." "I know exactly what's happening, Meredith," Neil said calmly. "I've known since I heard you and Amber discussing which dress would most appeal to Preston." Another silence, heavier this time. "You were supposed to be in Chicago," Meredith finally said, as if his presence had been the transgression. "And you were supposed to be my wife," Neil countered. "We all face disappointments." "Where are you?" Meredith asked, her tone shifting to placating. "Come home, Neil. We can talk about this like adults." "I'm not coming home," Neil stated firmly. "Not now, not soon. I've withdrawn enough money to sustain me. The rest remains in our accounts for household expenses. I've arranged for my portion of the bills to be paid automatically." "You can't just leave." Meredith's voice rose. "What about Amber? What about our life?" "Ask Preston about life," Neil suggested coldly. "He seems to have all the answers." Neil ended the call and turned off his phone. For the first time in decades, he was truly unreachable. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. That evening, standing on the beach as sunset painted the horizon in fiery oranges and reds, Neil made a solemn vow to himself. He would not be the victim in this story. He would not be remembered as the fool who lost everything. He would return to Oak Ridge, not as Neil Reeves, the betrayed husband, but as the architect of a retribution so complete that Meredith and Preston would never recover. The tide pulled at the sand beneath his feet, erasing his footprints, a fitting metaphor for what he was about to become. A man without a trace, gathering strength in the shadows before emerging to reclaim what was rightfully his. Chapter 4. Rebirth in the Shadows. Key West's perpetual sunshine mocked Neil's darkness. For 2 weeks, He maintained radio silence with everyone from his former life, except for Lucas, who provided updates on the digital front. Meredith had tried calling countless times before switching to increasingly desperate texts. Preston had sent professionally worded emails requesting contact. Amber had left voice messages that evolved from annoyed to confused to, in the most recent, tearful. Neil listened to that last message repeatedly, his daughter's voice breaking as she asked where he was, why he'd left them. The manipulation was almost admirable, as if she hadn't actively participated in destroying their family. Still, each replay weakened his resolve slightly, reminding him that despite everything, Amber was still his daughter. But Amber had made her choice. Now, Neil was making his. His transformation began physically. He grew a beard, let his meticulously maintained hair grow longer, spent hours in the sun until his skin bronzed. Daily swims and beach runs sculpted his body, burning away the softness that office life had cultivated. The man who stared back from the mirror increasingly resembled a stranger, exactly as Neil intended. 3 weeks into his exile, Neil received an unexpected call from Samuel Bennett, his former colleague at Pinnacle. "I shouldn't be telling you this," Samuel said without preamble, "but Preston announced your replacement today. Tessa Wilcox from the Atlanta office." "Tessa's qualified," Neil acknowledged. "Good choice." "That's not all," Samuel continued. "Preston's been systematically dismantling your client relationships, telling everyone you had a breakdown, that you're undergoing psychiatric treatment." Neil's grip tightened on the phone. "Interesting approach." "There's more." Samuel's voice lowered conspiratorially. "The Donovan account. Preston's claiming credit for the strategy you developed. The board's considering him for CEO when Phillips retires next year, largely based on the success of his Donovan campaign." The information settled into Neil like lead weights. Preston wasn't just taking his wife. He was erasing Neil's professional legacy as well. "Why are you telling me this, Samuel?" Neil asked. "Because it's wrong," Samuel replied simply, "and because I think you're planning something. Whatever it is, I want in." Neil hadn't considered allies in his revenge. The idea had merit, especially someone with inside access to Pinnacle. "I'll be in touch," Neil promised. That evening, Neil contacted Vincent Mercer again. This time, he was explicit about his intentions. "I want to understand every vulnerability in Preston Walsh's professional and personal life." Vincent's response was measured. "That's beyond standard legal counsel, Mr. Reeves." "I'm willing to pay for discretion and thoroughness," Neil replied. "Consider it opposition research." 3 days later, Vincent delivered a comprehensive dossier on Preston Walsh. 48 years old, divorced twice, both settlements heavily favoring Preston due to infidelity clauses Preston himself had violated repeatedly. His professional history showed a pattern. Join companies, take credit for subordinates' work, secure promotions, then move to larger firms. Pinnacle was his longest employment yet, 7 years, culminating in his current position as executive vice president. Most interestingly, Preston had financial vulnerabilities. He lived well beyond his means, maintaining a facade of wealth while quietly accumulating debt. His position at Pinnacle was particularly crucial now as he awaited the anticipated CEO promotion. "Preston needs the Donovan campaign to succeed," Neil mused aloud. "And he needs my silence about Meredith." Neil's plan crystallized around these insights. He wouldn't just reclaim his dignity. He would systematically dismantle everything Preston valued, starting with his professional reputation. Neil's next call was to Douglas Donovan himself, CEO of Donovan Enterprises and Pinnacle's most valuable client. Neil had cultivated their relationship personally over years. "Neil, where the hell have you been?" Douglas boomed when he answered. "Your boss has been spinning some story about stress leave." "That's partly why I'm calling," Neil replied. "I've left Pinnacle, Douglas. But before I go further in my career, I wanted to personally thank you for your business over the years." "Left Pinnacle?" Douglas sounded genuinely surprised. Walsh made it sound temporary. "Said you were coming back once you got your personal issues under control." "Preston has a vivid imagination," Neil said dryly. "The truth is simpler. It was time for a change." The conversation shifted to Neil's future plans, deliberately vague, and Douglas's recent expansion into international markets. By its conclusion, Neil had planted the first seed of doubt about Preston's version of events. The final element of Neil's Key West transformation was establishing new professional credentials. Using contacts cultivated over decades, he secured consulting offers from 3 of Pinnacle's competitors. He accepted none immediately, but kept the conversations active, pieces on his chessboard, waiting to be moved at the perfect moment. On the 30th day of his self-imposed exile, Neil booked a flight back to Oak Ridge, not to return home, but to establish a new base of operations closer to the battlefield. He rented a luxury apartment downtown, far from the suburban neighborhood where his former life with Meredith remained on pause. The night before his departure, Neil stood on the beach watching the sunset for the last time. The man who had arrived a month ago, broken, betrayed, reactive, was gone. In his place stood someone more dangerous, a man with nothing to lose and everything to reclaim. His phone buzzed with a text from Lucas. All systems ready. Your digital footprint now shows consistent activity in Chicago, as discussed. Neil smiled. Meredith and Preston believed he was hiding, licking his wounds in another city. They had no idea he was about to resurface in their backyard, a shark circling its prey. Chapter 5. The Countermove. Meredith Reeves slammed her phone down in frustration after another call went straight to Neil's voicemail. 6 weeks since he'd vanished, leaving her scrambling to explain his absence to their friends, to Amber's school, to their families. 6 weeks of Preston's increasingly possessive behavior, his initial charm curdling into something more controlling as he established himself in her life. Still nothing? Preston asked, loosening his tie as he made himself comfortable in what had been Neil's favorite chair in the living room. Nothing, Meredith confirmed, pouring herself another glass of wine. His credit card showed activity in Chicago again. A restaurant, then a hotel charge. He's not coming back, Meredith, Preston said with a finality that was meant to be comforting but felt oddly threatening. You need to accept that and move forward. With me. Meredith nodded absently, her thoughts tangled. When she'd begun flirting with Preston months ago, it had been harmless, a response to Neil's emotional distance, his constant focus on work. Preston had been attentive, made her feel desired again. But that was supposed to be a fantasy, not this complicated reality. I'm filing the abandonment papers next week, Preston continued, checking his watch. My attorney says it's a clear case. Neil walked away from his responsibilities. The courts will see that. Abandonment, Meredith repeated, the word bitter in her mouth. This wasn't how her story with Neil was supposed to end. Despite everything, she had never truly believed he would just disappear. The front door opened and closed, Amber's footsteps followed by a heavy silence as she noticed Preston in the living room. Again, Mr. Walsh, Amber acknowledged coldly. Her initial enthusiasm for the relationship had evaporated as the reality of Neil's absence settled in. Recently, she'd begun blaming Meredith, accusing her of driving Neil away. Amber, Preston nodded back. How was school? Any word from Dad? Amber asked Meredith, ignoring Preston's question. Credit card activity in Chicago, Meredith replied, watching her daughter's face fall. Nothing direct. Amber nodded tightly and headed upstairs without another word. The sound of her bedroom door closing echoed through the house. She'll adjust, Preston said dismissively. Teenagers are resilient. Meredith wasn't so sure. Amber had become withdrawn, her grades slipping. The school counselor had suggested therapy to help her process what she perceived as abandonment by her father. I need to speak with Douglas Donovan tomorrow, Preston said, changing the subject. The campaign launch is next week, and he's been oddly distant lately, questioning elements of the strategy. I thought everything was approved months ago, Meredith replied, genuinely concerned. The Donovan campaign was Preston's ticket to the CEO position, his obsession for the past year. It was, Preston frowned. Something's changed. I just need to reassure him that everything's on track despite Neil's departure. As Preston outlined his plans for the Donovan meeting, Meredith found her attention drifting. She glanced at the family photo on the mantel, Neil, herself, and Amber at the lake last summer, all smiling. Had Neil been happy then, or already distant? Had she missed the signs of his unhappiness, or simply chosen to ignore them in favor of Preston's flattery? The doorbell interrupted her reverie. Meredith froze, irrationally hoping it might be Neil, finally returning. Preston moved to answer it, assuming the authority of the household in a way that suddenly irritated her. "I've got it," Meredith said sharply, rising to open the door. A courier stood on the porch, holding an envelope. Delivery from Meredith Reeves. The envelope contained divorce papers. Not abandonment proceedings as Preston had suggested, but a straightforward, no-fault divorce filing from Neil. The documents were meticulous, detailing an equitable split of assets that favored Meredith slightly. Neil was waiving alimony claims and requesting minimal visitation with Amber. "He's making it easy," Preston said, reading over her shoulder. "This is good, Meredith. Clean break." But attached to the filing was a personal note in Neil's handwriting. "This isn't the ending I wanted for us, but it's the one you chose. Tell Amber I love her, regardless of her role in this. As for Preston, I hope he's worth everything you're losing." The words hit Meredith like physical blows. Neil knew, had known before he left. And still, his divorce terms were fair, even generous. It wasn't the action of a man having a breakdown. It was calculated, controlled. Preston took the papers from her trembling hands. "I'll have my attorney review these tomorrow. Don't worry about a thing." Later that night, after Preston had left and Amber was asleep, Meredith poured another glass of wine and reread Neil's note. For the first time, she considered the possibility that she had catastrophically miscalculated, not just in betraying Neil, but in underestimating him. The Neil she thought she knew would have fought messily for their marriage, would have confronted Preston, would have raged and pleaded. This cold, calculated response was from a stranger. Across town, in his downtown apartment, Neil watched the timestamp on the delivery confirmation for the divorce papers. By now, Meredith would have read his note. Preston would be planning their next steps, confident in his victory. Neil's phone rang. Samuel Bennett. "Preston's meeting with Donovan tomorrow," Samuel reported. "He's nervous." The preliminary feedback on the campaign materials wasn't what he expected. "Because Donovan's looking for my influence in the strategy," Neil replied. "An influence that's conspicuously absent since Preston reworked everything to take credit." "Exactly," Samuel confirmed. "Also, the board meeting to discuss the CEO position has been moved up. 3 weeks from now, not next quarter." "Perfect timing," Neil said, making a note on his calendar. "Has Preston announced it to the team yet?" "No, but he's already acting like it's confirmed. Moved into a bigger office, hired an assistant with executive experience." Neil smiled grimly. "Pride before the fall, Samuel. Keep me updated." His next call was to Vincent Mercer, who had been monitoring the delivery of the divorce papers. "Did she sign for them personally?" "Yes," Vincent confirmed. "And the timing was as you requested. Walsh was present." "Good," Neil replied. Now we wait for their response before proceeding to Phase 2. Neil pulled up the surveillance photos Vincent's investigator had taken over the past week. Preston entering and leaving Neil's home at various hours. Meredith and Preston at restaurants, his hand possessively on her lower back. Preston's car in Neil's driveway overnight. Each image stoked Neil's resolve. He opened his laptop, reviewing the presentation he'd prepared for Douglas Donovan. Not a direct attack on Preston's strategy, but an alternative approach that subtly highlighted the flaws in Preston's concept while presenting solutions that only Neil could execute. Tomorrow, while Preston was meeting with Donovan officially, Neil would be having lunch with Donovan's wife, Elaine, a school board member who had always appreciated Neil's contributions to educational initiatives. A casual lunch between old friends, during which Neil would ensure his presentation found its way to Douglas. Phase 2 was now in motion. Preston's professional destruction would begin with the Donovan campaign, the very vehicle he had planned to use for his ascension to CEO. And once Preston's career began to crumble, his relationship with Meredith would follow. Neil closed his laptop, satisfied with the day's developments. The pieces were moving exactly as he'd planned. Soon, Meredith and Preston would realize that Neil hadn't been hiding in Chicago, nursing his wounds. He had been transforming into their worst nightmare. Chapter 6. Shadows and Whispers. 2 days after the divorce papers arrived, Neil finally answered one of Amber's calls. He steeled himself against the emotional manipulation he anticipated, reminding himself of her betrayal. "Dad," Amber's voice was small, uncertain. "Where are you? Why'd you leave like this?" "I think you know why." "Amber," Neil replied evenly. "I heard you and your mother discussing which dress would best appeal to Preston." Silence stretched between them, then a shaky breath. I didn't know Mom was actually going to." "Don't," Neil interrupted. "I heard everything. Your encouragement, your dismissal of me. Dad never takes you anywhere nice anymore. Remember that. I was just trying to make Mom happy." Amber's voice cracked. "She's been so sad, and you were always working in. And that justifies betrayal?" Neil asked. "Teaching your mother how to deceive me more effectively?" "No," Amber whispered. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't think. That's evident." Neil cut in. "Actions have consequences, Amber, even well-intentioned ones." After a pause, Amber asked, "Are you coming home?" "That's not my home anymore," Neil answered. "Your mother made her choice. You supported that choice. Now we all live with the consequences." "But the divorce papers, they say you don't even want to see me." Amber's voice broke fully now. Neil closed his eyes, fighting against the parental instinct to comfort her. "I thought that's what you wanted. A clean break so Preston could step in as your new father figure." "I don't want Preston," Amber shouted suddenly. "I hate him. He's controlling Mom, criticizing everything I do. He's not you, Dad." The revelation should have been satisfying, but Neil found only a hollow ache where triumph should have been. "I'll consider amending the visitation schedule," he finally said. "But I need time, Amber. You broke my trust in a fundamental way." After ending the call, Neil sat motionless, processing. Amber's distress seemed genuine, her dislike of Preston unexpected. It was the first variable in his plan that didn't align with his predictions. He put the thought aside as his phone rang again. Douglas Donovan. "Neil, we need to talk," Douglas said without preamble. "That presentation you sent Elaine, it addresses exactly the concerns I've been having about Walsh's approach." "I thought it might," Neil replied, satisfaction replacing his earlier disquiet. "Preston has a tendency to prioritize flash over substance." "He's meeting with my team tomorrow to address concerns," Douglas continued. "But between us, I'm considering pulling the campaign entirely if he can't provide better solutions." "That would be unfortunate for Pinnacle," Neil said carefully, "and for Preston personally, given his CEO aspirations." Douglas's interest was palpable. "CEO aspirations? Phillips isn't retiring for years." "Actually, the board meeting to discuss succession is in 3 weeks," Neil revealed. "Preston's considered the frontrunner, largely due to the projected success of your campaign." "Son of a bitch," Douglas muttered. "He's been rushing this campaign to secure a promotion, not because it's what's best for Donovan Enterprises." "I couldn't possibly comment on Preston's motivations," Neil said diplomatically. "Would you consider coming back to Pinnacle?" Douglas asked abruptly. "Taking over the campaign?" "I'm afraid that bridge is thoroughly burned," Neil replied. "But I'm establishing my own consulting firm. I could offer my services directly to Donovan Enterprises, circumventing Pinnacle entirely." The conversation ended with tentative plans for Neil to present his vision to Donovan's board the following week, directly competing with Preston's revised strategy. As Neil ended the call, a text from Samuel arrived. "Walsh is panicking. Donovan meeting yesterday was a disaster. He's blaming your sabotage, but can't explain how you could possibly influence Donovan for Chicago." Neil smiled. Preston still believed he was hiding across the country, unaware that Neil had established a base of operations in Oak Ridge itself, dismantling Preston's life from within. That evening, Neil implemented the next phase of his plan, social destruction. He arranged to meet Trevor and Sophia Wilson, the hosts of Oak Ridge's most influential social circles and longtime friends of Neil and Meredith. The upscale restaurant Neil selected was deliberately visible, a clear statement that he wasn't hiding. He arrived early, securing a table with optimal visibility from both the entrance and the bar. Trevor and Sophia arrived precisely on time, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. The hugs they offered Neil were genuine, their questions immediate. "Where have you been?" Sophia demanded. "Meredith's been telling everyone you had some kind of breakdown." "Is that what she's saying?" Neil asked mildly, signaling for drinks. "Interesting narrative. She and that boss of yours have been inseparable," Trevor added, studying Neil carefully. "We assumed, well, you know what we assumed. That I'd been replaced," Neil nodded. "Both professionally and personally. You assumed correctly." Over the next 2 hours, Neil shared a carefully curated version of events. His discovery of Meredith and Preston's betrayal, his strategic retreat to regroup rather than react emotionally, his decision to start fresh professionally with his own consulting firm. He presented himself not as victim, but as strategic player, emphasizing his controlled response and future plans. "So you're staying in Oak Ridge?" Sophia asked, clearly impressed by Neil's composure. "Absolutely," Neil confirmed. "I've built a life here. I won't be driven away by my wife's affair." By dessert, Trevor and Sophia were fully aligned with Neil's perspective, their loyalty shifting palpably. Neil knew that by morning, their influential social network would be buzzing with his version of events, painting Meredith not as the wronged wife abandoned by an unstable husband, but as the unfaithful spouse who drove away a good man. The next phase of Neil's plan required direct confrontation. As he bid goodbye to the Wilsons, Neil spotted a familiar figure at the bar. Vanessa Parker, Meredith's closest friend and confidant. Neil approached casually, as if running into her was coincidental. "Vanessa, good to see you." Vanessa's shock was evident. "Neil, what are you? Everyone thinks you're in Chicago having some kind of crisis." "That's a convenient story from Meredith and Preston," Neil replied, signaling the bartender. "Bourbon neat, and whatever Ms. Parker is drinking." Vanessa studied him cautiously. "You look different. Good different." "Clarity will do that," Neil said, accepting his drink. "How is Meredith? Still wearing the red dress for Preston?" Vanessa's composure cracked slightly. "You know, I know everything," Neil confirmed, "including the fact that you've been covering for her for months. Alibi lunches, fake shopping trips. She's my friend," Vanessa said defensively. She was unhappy. And now, is she happy with Preston living in my house, sleeping in my bed, trying to replace me with Amber? Vanessa's hesitation told Neil everything. "It's complicated. Preston isn't exactly what she expected." Neil leaned closer, his voice lowered conspiratorially. "Let me guess. The charming, attentive man who pursued her has become controlling, critical, possibly even jealous." Vanessa's expression confirmed his assessment. Neil continued, "That's his pattern, Vanessa. Both his ex-wives could have warned Meredith if Preston hadn't systematically isolated them after the divorces." "How do you know all this?" Vanessa asked, clearly unnerved. "I made it my business to know," Neil replied simply. "Preston Walsh is a predator who targets women in vulnerable marriages, love bombs them into affairs, then reveals his true nature once he's secured his position. Meredith is already experiencing phase 3. Neil finished his bourbon and stood to leave. "Tell Meredith I'm not in Chicago having a breakdown. I'm right here in Oak Ridge, watching Preston systematically destroy everything I built, including her happiness. The question is, when she finally realizes who Preston really is, will there be anything left of her life to salvage?" As Neil walked away, he knew Vanessa would relay every word to Meredith. The seed of doubt was planted. Combined with Preston's inevitable professional collapse following the Donovan disaster, that seed would grow into panic. Neil returned to his apartment, satisfied with the evening's progress. A text waited from Lucas. Meredith tried accessing her email again. Secondary account captured her attempts as programmed. "She's getting desperate." Neil smiled grimly. Meredith was searching for evidence, for explanation, for anything to help her understand the calculated dismantling of her carefully constructed narrative. She would find nothing except what Neil wanted her to see, breadcrumbs leading exactly where he intended. As Neil prepared for bed, his phone rang one final time. "Amber." "Dad." Her voice was hushed, secretive. "I need to tell you something. About Preston. About what he's really doing." Neil listened intently as his daughter detailed Preston's increasingly controlling behavior, his subtle manipulation of Meredith, his not-so-subtle attempts to access Neil's home office and personal files. The information confirmed Neil's assessment of Preston's character, but added new dimensions to consider. Don't confront him, Neil advised Amber. Document everything. Text me if anything changes. And Amber? Thank you for telling me. After ending the call, Neil made additional notes in his plan. Preston was moving faster than anticipated, becoming careless in his confidence. That carelessness would be his undoing. Neil fell asleep that night with the satisfaction of a chess master watching his opponent move exactly as predicted, unaware that checkmate was already inevitable. Chapter 7. The First Domino. The boardroom at Donovan Enterprises hummed with anticipation as Neil concluded his presentation. The contrast between his vision and Preston's couldn't have been starker. Where Preston had proposed flashy campaigns prioritizing immediate visibility, Neil had outlined a comprehensive strategy building sustainable brand loyalty. Questions? Neil asked, standing confidently before Donovan's executive team. Douglas Donovan leaned forward. Timeline for implementation: 3 months for full rollout, Neil replied. But initial elements could launch within weeks. Cost comparison to Pinnacle's proposal: 20% lower overall, with higher projected conversion rates. Neil distributed detailed budgets supporting his claims. As the meeting concluded, Douglas pulled Neil aside. Walsh is presenting his revised strategy tomorrow. After this, Douglas shook his head. Let's just say Pinnacle's position is precarious. Neil nodded, satisfaction flowing through him. I appreciate the opportunity, Douglas. One more thing, Douglas added. Phillips called me this morning. Asked about your departure from Pinnacle. Seemed concerned about Walsh's version of events. Robert Phillips called you directly? Neil asked, referencing Pinnacle CEO. We play golf occasionally, Douglas shrugged. I mentioned our meeting today. He seemed unsurprised that you'd landed on your feet. Less pleased about potentially losing Donovan business to your new venture. This was an unexpected development. Phillips taking direct interest suggested the situation at Pinnacle was already deteriorating. Neil had anticipated a slower unraveling. What did you tell him? Neil asked carefully. The truth, Douglas replied. That Walsh's campaign was substandard, that you'd presented a superior alternative, and that I'd be making my decision by week's end. Neil's phone buzzed with a text from Samuel. Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow morning. Phillips requested all Q3 campaign materials, especially Donovan. The dominoes were falling faster than Neil had anticipated. He thanked Douglas and departed, his mind racing with adjustments to his timeline. Outside Donovan Enterprises, Neil encountered the last person he expected, Meredith, waiting beside his car. What did you find me? Neil asked, maintaining his composure despite his surprise. Vanessa told me about your conversation, Meredith replied, studying him as if seeing a stranger. You look different. I'm different, Neil acknowledged, unlocking his car. What do you want, Meredith? To understand, she said simply. This calculated disappearance, the meticulous divorce filing, now competing directly with Preston. This isn't you, Neil. No, this isn't the Neil you knew, he corrected. The predictable, reliable man you took for granted. That Neil died the moment I heard you and Amber planning your date with Preston. Meredith flinched at the coldness in his tone. I never meant to hurt you. It just happened. Affairs don't just happen, Neil replied. They're choices. Series of choices. You made yours. I'm making mine. By destroying Preston professionally? Meredith challenged. He says you're sabotaging the Donovan account. Neil laughed, the sound devoid of humor. I simply offered a better strategy. If Preston's work can't compete with mine, that's hardly sabotage. What do you want, Neil? Meredith asked, frustration evident. Revenge? Is that it? I want what I've always wanted, Neil answered honestly. Recognition for my work. Loyalty from those who promised it. Since I can't have those from you or Pinnacle, I'm creating alternatives. And Amber? Meredith asked, her voice softening. She misses you desperately. Neil studied his wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, noting the strain around her eyes, the defensive posture. Amber made her choice when she helped you deceive me. She's living with the consequences, just as you are. Preston isn't what I thought, Meredith admitted suddenly, her composure cracking. He's become different since you left. No, Neil corrected. He's showing you who he always was. The charming facade was the deception, not this new, controlling behavior. Meredith's expression confirmed Neil's assessment. How did you know? Research, Neil replied simply. Something you might have done before destroying our marriage. As Neil moved to enter his car, Meredith placed a hand on his arm. The divorce papers, they're fair. More than fair. Why? Because I'm not the villain in this story, Meredith, Neil answered. I never was. Remember that in the coming weeks. With that cryptic warning, Neil drove away, leaving Meredith staring after him. In his rearview mirror, he watched her pull out her phone, undoubtedly calling Preston. Good. Let Preston know that Neil wasn't hiding, wasn't broken, but executing a plan that would soon engulf them both. Neil's next stop was a meeting with Robert Phillips himself, arranged hastily after a surprising call from Phillips's assistant. They met at the Oak Ridge Golf Club, neutral territory away from Pinnacle's offices. Phillips was waiting on the terrace, his usual confident demeanor subdued. Neil, thank you for meeting me on such short notice. Of course, Robert, Neil replied, settling into the chair across from his former CEO. Though I must admit, I'm curious about the invitation. Phillips sighed heavily. I'm going to be direct. The Donovan account represents 30% of Pinnacle's annual revenue. Douglas tells me he's strongly considering moving that business to your new consultancy. Douglas values results, Neil said neutrally. My strategy better serves his needs. Walsh claims you stole proprietary information, that your proposal builds on work you developed at Pinnacle. Neil smiled thinly. I developed the original Donovan strategy, yes. Preston modified it after my departure, poorly, according to Douglas. My new proposal shares no elements with either version. Vincent Mercer has documentation confirming this if legal concerns arise. Phillips studied Neil carefully. This isn't just business for you, is it? This is about Walsh. About your wife. Ex-wife. Soon enough, Neil corrected. And no, this isn't personal. This is professional recalibration. Preston took credit for my work for years while actively undermining my advancement. Now he's facing the consequences of his mediocrity without my contributions to elevate him. He's being considered for COO, not CEO as he believes, Phillips revealed unexpectedly. Though after the Donovan situation, even that's in question. This information required Neil to reassess. Preston's position was already more precarious than he'd realized. What are you proposing, Robert? Neil asked directly. A compromise, Phillips replied. Return to Pinnacle as Chief Strategy Officer, reporting directly to me. Complete autonomy over your team and projects. Walsh remains in sales, but loses the Donovan account. It returns to you. The offer was tempting, vindication, promotion, Preston's effective demotion. But it fell short of Neil's ultimate goal. And if I decline? Neil asked. Then we become competitors, Phillips said simply. You take Donovan, possibly others. Pinnacle suffers. Walsh suffers more specifically. His advancement would be impossible after such a loss. Neil considered the options carefully. I need time to consider. The board meets tomorrow, Phillips reminded him. I need your answer by tonight. As Phillips departed, Neil received a text from Amber. Preston's freaking out, yelling at Mom about you sabotaging him. He broke a vase. I'm scared, Dad. The message was accompanied by a video. Preston raging in Neil's former living room, gesturing wildly as he accused Meredith of undermining him by meeting with Neil. In the background, Meredith's fearful attempts to calm him only fueled his anger. Neil watched the video twice, then called Amber immediately. Are you safe? Yeah, Amber whispered. I'm in my room. Mom told me to lock the door. Has he been violent before? Neil asked, already pulling up Vincent's number on his second phone. Not like this, Amber replied. Usually it's just yelling, criticizing Mom, telling her she's lucky he's still around after everything. But today it's worse. Stay in your room, Neil instructed. If anything escalates, call 911 immediately, then me. Understand. After ensuring Amber was secure, Neil called Vincent. I need an emergency restraining order. Preston Walsh. Evidence of threatening behavior toward my daughter. Vincent's response was immediate. Send the video. I'll have papers filed within the hour. Where are you now? Heading home. Neil replied, the words slipping out unconsciously. Not his apartment. Home, where his daughter was afraid, where his soon-to-be ex-wife was facing the consequences of her choices in a more immediate way than Neil had intended. Neil's plan had been calculated destruction of Preston's career, his reputation, his relationship with Meredith. He hadn't anticipated physical danger to Amber. That changed everything. As Neil drove toward his former home, his phone rang. Samuel. Preston just left Pinnacle, Samuel reported urgently. He's unhinged, Neil, accusing everyone of conspiring against him. He knows about your meeting with Phillips. I'm handling it, Neil assured him. How did he seem when he left? Dangerous, Samuel replied without hesitation. Security almost intervened. Talk around the office is that he's finished regardless of tomorrow's board decision. Neil ended the call as he turned onto his former street. Preston's car was still in the driveway. No sign of movement from the house. Neil parked at a neighbor's home. The Fosters were away on vacation and approached cautiously, triggering the remote access to the home security system he'd maintained despite moving out. Camera feeds appeared on his phone. Preston pacing in the kitchen, gesticulating as he spoke to Meredith, who stood rigid against the counter. No sign of physical violence yet, but Preston's body language signaled escalating agitation. Neil texted Amber, I'm outside. Police and lawyer have been called. Stay put. Her reply was immediate. Hurry, Dad. He's getting worse. Neil approached the front door, decision made. His revenge had been meant to be professional, a systematic dismantling of Preston's carefully constructed life. But with Amber in potential danger, the plan changed. Some situations required direct intervention. Neil rang the doorbell, positioning himself carefully out of view of the peephole. Footsteps approached. Preston's heavy tread, not Meredith's lighter step. The door swung open. Preston's face transforming from annoyance to shock to rage in rapid succession. You, he snarled. You've ruined everything. Actually, Neil replied calmly. You did that yourself, Preston. I simply stopped covering for your mediocrity. Preston lunged forward, exactly as Neil had anticipated. Years of weekend boxing, a stress relief habit Preston had often mocked, served Neil well as he sidestepped the clumsy attack, using Preston's momentum to propel him onto the front lawn. Neil! Meredith appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of relief and horror. Get Amber, Neil instructed, not taking his eyes off Preston, who was regaining his balance. Take her to the Wilsons. Now, Preston charged again, blind with rage. This time, Neil didn't dodge. He met the attack, a single strike that dropped Preston to his knees, gasping. You destroyed my marriage, Neil said quietly, standing over his former boss. You took credit for my work. You threatened my daughter. Consider yourself fortunate that my response has been this restrained. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Vincent's doing, undoubtedly. Neil stepped back as Preston struggled to rise. This isn't over, Preston wheezed. Actually, it is, Neil replied. Completely over. By morning, you'll have lost your job prospects, your relationship, and possibly your freedom, depending on how those restraining order hearings go. As police cruisers pulled up and officers approached cautiously, Neil turned to find Meredith watching from the doorway, Amber beside her, both wide-eyed. Go to the Wilsons, Neil repeated gently. Give your statements to the officers there. I'll handle this. For the first time in months, Meredith didn't argue. She simply nodded, guiding Amber toward her car. As they drove away, Neil turned back to the officers now securing Preston. Neil Reeves, he introduced himself. That's Preston Walsh. I have video evidence of him threatening my daughter and soon-to-be ex-wife. My attorney is filing for an emergency restraining order as we speak. As officers separated them for questioning, Neil watched Preston being placed in a cruiser, his professional demeanor finally shattered completely. The first phase of Neil's revenge was complete. Preston's career and reputation lay in ruins. But the cost had been higher than Neil anticipated, pulling Amber into danger he'd never intended. His phone buzzed with a text from Robert Phillips. Just heard about Walsh. Board meeting moved up to tonight. Your offer still stands. Decision? Neil looked at the house he'd once shared with Meredith and Amber, at the police now documenting the scene, at Preston glaring hatefully from the back of a police cruiser. His carefully orchestrated revenge had accelerated beyond his control, transforming into something messy, but perhaps more honest than his original plan. He texted back, I decline. Donovan is just the first account I'll be taking with me. Phillips's response was immediate. Your choice. Walsh is finished regardless. Good luck, Neil. As Neil gave his statement to the officers, he realized his revenge had succeeded beyond his expectations, but not in the way he'd planned. The true victory wasn't in destroying Preston professionally or exposing Meredith's affair. It was in rediscovering his own strength, in breaking free from the boundaries that had defined him for so long. The Neil Reeves who had stood frozen in the doorway, devastated by betrayal, was gone. In his place stood a man who had faced darkness, both external and internal, and emerged stronger, more defined, more authentic than before. Chapter 8. Ashes and Embers. The following week unfolded like a series of aftershocks following an earthquake. Preston Walsh was released on bail, immediately served with a restraining order preventing him from contacting Meredith, Amber, or Neil. Pinnacle Industries announced his resignation the same day, though industry insiders referred to it as a termination. By week's end, Neil's new consultancy, Phoenix Strategy Group, had secured not only the Donovan account, but 2 other former Pinnacle clients as well. Neil leased office space downtown, hired a small team of talented strategists overlooked by Pinnacle, and established himself as a formidable competitor in the market. The professional resurrection was complete. The personal reconciliation remained complicated. Amber had texted daily since the confrontation, her messages evolving from fearful gratitude to tentative questions about their relationship. Neil had responded carefully, maintaining boundaries while acknowledging her efforts to reconnect. Meredith had been more direct. The morning after Preston's arrest, she appeared at Neil's apartment, composed but clearly shaken. Thank you, she said simply when he opened the door. For coming when Amber called. For stopping him. Neil nodded, maintaining emotional distance despite the familiar scent of her perfume. Amber's safety is non-negotiable, no matter what's happened between us. The divorce papers, Meredith said hesitantly. I haven't signed them yet. Why? Neil asked, genuinely curious. Preston's gone, but so is our marriage. Because I made a terrible mistake, Meredith admitted, her composure cracking. I was flattered by Preston's attention, felt valued in ways I hadn't with you in years. But it wasn't real. None of it was real. That doesn't change what happened, Neil replied steadily. You betrayed me. Amber helped you. Those actions had consequences. I know, Meredith whispered. I need to know if there's any possibility, any chance at all, that you could forgive me. That we could try again somehow. Neil studied the woman he'd loved for nearly half his life. The anger that had fueled his initial disappearance had transmuted into something colder, more distant. Not hate. He realized with mild surprise that he no longer hated Meredith, but an absence where love had once resided. I don't know, he answered honestly. I'm not the same person I was before. I don't want the same things. What do you want, Neil? Meredith asked, tears threatening. Time, he replied after consideration. Space to discover who I am now, who you are beyond the affair, who we might be, separately or together. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something Meredith clearly hadn't expected, the possibility of a future conversation, if not reconciliation. Now, a week later, Neil sat in his new office overlooking downtown Oak Ridge, considering his next steps. The revenge that had consumed him for months had been executed, its targets appropriately devastated. Yet the victory felt hollow, incomplete. Not because he desired more punishment from Meredith and Preston, but because he had yet to fully determine what he wanted beyond retribution. Samuel Bennett entered after a cursory knock, interrupting Neil's thoughts. Having resigned from Pinnacle to join Phoenix, Samuel had become Neil's de facto second-in-command. Phillips called, Samuel reported. Wants to discuss a potential merger. Pinnacle stock dropped 15% this week. Neil nodded, unsurprised. Counterproposal. Acquisition, not merger, Samuel suggested. We value their client portfolio and some key personnel, but the leadership needs complete restructuring. Draft terms, Neil approved. Include retention bonuses for their strategy team, but executive replacements across the board. As Samuel departed, Neil's phone rang. Vincent Mercer. Preston Walsh accepted a plea deal. Vincent reported without preamble. Misdemeanor charges, probation, mandatory anger management, and permanent restraining orders for both Meredith and Amber. Professional repercussions? Neil asked. Significant, Vincent confirmed. The arrest and plea make him essentially unhireable at his previous level. Several executive recruitment firms have already removed him from their candidate pools. After ending the call, Neil leaned back in his chair, contemplating the developments. Preston Walsh had been neutralized professionally and personally, his predatory pattern interrupted before it could progress to its usual conclusion. Meredith was facing the consequences of her choices, but showing genuine remorse. Amber was working to rebuild trust, attending therapy to process the upheaval of recent months. Neil's revenge was complete. The question now was what to build from the ashes. His phone buzzed with a text from Amber. Dad, can we talk? In person? Neil hesitated before replying. Dinner tonight? 7 p.m. at Giovanni's. Her response was immediate. Thank you. See you then. Giovanni's had been their special place, where Neil had taken Amber for father-daughter dinners since she was little. The choice was deliberate, a small opening in the wall he'd constructed around his heart. That evening, Neil arrived early, securing their usual corner booth. Amber entered precisely at 7, her expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She'd lost weight, Neil noted, and something of her youthful exuberance had dimmed. Dad, she greeted him cautiously. Amber, Neil replied, standing to receive her awkward hug before they both sat. After ordering margarita pizza to share their tradition, Amber spoke quietly. I need to explain. About Preston, about what happened. Neil nodded, allowing her the space to continue. Mom was unhappy, Amber began. For months before, everything. She tried talking to you about feeling disconnected, but you were always working, always focused elsewhere. Neil started to defend himself, but stopped, recognizing the partial truth in her words. He had been distant, consumed by career advancement. Preston noticed. Amber continued. He paid attention to her, complimented her, made her feel valued. I thought. She paused, collecting herself. I thought he genuinely cared about her. About us, maybe. I encouraged it because Mom seemed happy again. And the red dress? Neil asked, referencing the catalyst of his discovery. Amber looked down, ashamed. Preston mentioned once that he thought Mom looked beautiful in red. I remembered that when she was getting ready for dinner with him. I didn't know then that they were. I thought it was just friends. When did you realize it wasn't? Neil pressed gently. After you left, Amber admitted. Preston changed almost immediately. Started criticizing Mom, controlling when she could go out, who she could talk to. He went through your office, your personal papers. When I objected, he told me I was being disloyal to Mom. The server arrived with their pizza, providing a momentary reprieve from the difficult conversation. After he departed, Neil spoke carefully. I understand why you encourage your mother's friendship with Preston. I even understand missing the signs that it had become more. What I struggle with is why you didn't tell me what was happening. Amber's eyes filled with tears. Because I was ashamed. I helped break up our family. Then I was afraid of Preston, of losing you completely. By the time I realized how bad things were getting, you were gone. Neil reached across the table, taking his daughter's hand for the first time in months. I'm sorry you were afraid, that you felt you couldn't reach out sooner. Are you and Mom getting divorced for sure? Amber asked, hope flickering in her expression. I don't know, Neil answered truthfully. What happened changed me, changed all of us. I need time to determine what comes next. But you don't hate us? Amber asked, vulnerability raw in her voice. No, Neil replied, squeezing her hand. I don't hate either of you. I'm hurt, disappointed, still processing. But not hateful. It wasn't complete forgiveness. Neil wasn't ready for that. But it was a beginning. A recognition that his revenge, while justified, had created collateral damage he hadn't fully anticipated. Amber had been both participant and victim, caught between adult complexities beyond her full comprehension. As they shared their pizza, conversation shifted to safer topics. Amber's college applications, Neil's new company, the therapy they were both pursuing separately. The evening ended with another hug, this one less awkward, more genuine. "I miss you, Dad," Amber whispered as they parted. "I miss you too," Neil admitted, the truth of it surprising him. "We'll figure this out, one step at a time." Later that night, in his downtown apartment, Neil received a text from Meredith. "Amber told me about dinner. Thank you for giving her that space. Would you consider meeting with me too? No pressure for reconciliation, just conversation." Neil stared at the message, weighing his response. The revenge that had driven him for months was complete. Preston was professionally ruined, legally constrained, socially ostracized. Meredith had experienced the consequences of her betrayal. The public humiliation, the fear of Preston's true nature revealed, the potential loss of her family. What remained now was the question of what Neil truly wanted for his future. Not reaction, not retribution, but purposeful choice. He typed his reply, Sunday, coffee at Riverside Park, 10 a.m. It wasn't a promise of reconciliation. It wasn't even a guarantee of forgiveness. But it was an opening, a small crack in the wall of his resolve where light might eventually penetrate. As Neil prepared for bed, his phone rang one final time. Robert Phillips. "I've reviewed your acquisition proposal," Phillips said without preamble. "The board has counteroffered. Not what you asked for, but close." "Send it over," Neil replied. "I'll review it tomorrow." "One more thing," Phillips added. "This vendetta against Walsh, is it finished? Some board members are concerned about lingering hostilities affecting the transition." Neil considered the question carefully. "It's done," he finally replied. "Walsh destroyed himself. I simply accelerated the process." After ending the call, Neil stood at his apartment window, gazing out at the Oak Ridge skyline. The city that had witnessed his humiliation would now witness his resurrection. Professionally, personally, completely. Neil Reeves had entered the crucible of betrayal and emerged not just intact, but transformed, tempered by fire into something stronger than before. His revenge was complete. His redemption was just beginning. Chapter 9. Phoenix Rising. 3 months after Preston Walsh's arrest, Neil stood at the podium addressing the combined employees of Phoenix Strategy Group and the newly acquired Pinnacle Industries. The merger, effectively an acquisition despite the diplomatic terminology, had been finalized the previous week, creating one of the region's most powerful marketing consultancies. "Today marks not an ending, but a beginning," Neil told the assembled staff. Phoenix Pinnacle represents the best of both organizations. Pinnacle's established client base and Phoenix's innovative approach. From his position at the front of the conference room, Neil could see Samuel Bennett nodding approvingly, alongside Robert Phillips, who had accepted a reduced role as senior advisor in the new organization. In the back row sat Amber, attending the announcement as part of her senior year business internship program. Her presence a symbol of the gradual healing between father and daughter. Conspicuously absent was Meredith. Their Sunday coffee meetings had become a regular occurrence over the past months. Sometimes tense, sometimes wistful, always honest. The divorce had been finalized 6 weeks earlier. A mutual decision reached after several counseling sessions revealed that while forgiveness was possible, rebuilding their marriage would require more than either was prepared to give. After concluding his address and handling the obligatory press questions, Neil found Amber waiting by his office. "That was impressive, Dad," she said, genuine pride in her voice. "From starting Phoenix to acquiring Pinnacle in 3 months? Even my business teacher was blown away when I told him." Neil smiled, the expression coming more naturally now than it had months ago. "Pinnacle was vulnerable. We were nimble. Good business strategy, that's all. And a dash of revenge," Amber added perceptively as they entered his office. "Though you'll never admit that part. Their relationship had evolved into something new. Not the easy closeness of before, but a more mature connection built on painful honesty and careful reconstruction. Amber's therapy had helped her understand her role in the family fracture. Neil's had helped him separate his daughter's actions from Meredith's choices. "How's your mother?" Neil asked, gesturing for Amber to sit. "Better," Amber replied. "The new teaching position starts next week." She's nervous but excited. Following the divorce, Meredith had returned to her original career passion, education, securing a position teaching art at Oak Ridge Community College. The job represented her own phoenix rising, a reclamation of identity separate from both Neil and the disaster with Preston. In the house, Neil inquired. The divorce settlement had left Meredith the family home, though she had recently mentioned considering selling it. "She's listing it next month," Amber confirmed. "Too many memories," she says. "Plus it's too big for just us when I leave for college next fall." Neil nodded, understanding the decision. He had no attachment to the house anymore. It represented a chapter now closed. "Speaking of your college plans," Neil segued, pulling a folder from his desk. "I've been researching programs that align with your interest in business psychology." As they discussed Amber's future, Neil reflected on how dramatically his life had transformed since that devastating moment in the doorway, overhearing his daughter's innocent betrayal. The revenge that had consumed him had ultimately led to professional triumph. Phoenix Pinnacle was more successful than either company had been separately, but the personal landscape remained permanently altered. After Amber departed for her afternoon classes, Neil received an unexpected visitor, Vanessa Parker, Meredith's friend. "Neil," she greeted him, uncomfortable but determined. "Do you have a moment?" "Vanessa," Neil acknowledged, gesturing to the chair Amber had vacated. "What can I do for you?" "I saw the announcement about the merger," Vanessa began. "Impressive accomplishment." "Thank you," Neil replied neutrally, waiting for her to reach her point. Vanessa shifted, clearly struggling with whatever had brought her to his office. "I owe you an apology," she finally said, "for my role in Meredith's indiscretion, for facilitating their meetings, covering for her." Neil studied Meredith's oldest friend, noting the genuine regret in her expression. "You were being loyal to her," he acknowledged. "Misguided but loyal." "I should have discouraged it," Vanessa insisted. Walsh showed red flags from the beginning. Possessiveness, isolation tactics, love bombing. "I saw it, but ignored it because Meredith seemed happy initially." Neil leaned back, considering her words. "Why tell me this now, Vanessa? The divorce is final. Meredith and I have reached our separate peace." "Because she's dating again," Vanessa revealed. "Nothing serious, just coffee with a professor from the college. But I'm worried she'll repeat patterns, make the same mistakes. She values your opinion more than anyone's. Still, if you could talk to her." The request surprised Neil. After everything, Meredith still valued his insight? The thought was both flattering and discomfiting. "I'll consider it," Neil finally replied, not committing further. After Vanessa left, Neil turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, gazing out at the city where his destruction and rebirth had played out so publicly. 3 months ago, he had been consumed by revenge, focused solely on destroying Preston Walsh and punishing Meredith. Now, with those objectives accomplished, Neil found himself facing an unexpected emotion, concern for his ex-wife's well-being. That evening, Neil called Meredith, not their scheduled Sunday conversation, but a spontaneous reaching out that surprised them both. "Is everything okay?" Meredith asked immediately, worry evident in her voice. "Is Amber?" "Amber's fine," Neil assured her. "I just wanted to check in. Vanessa mentioned you're seeing someone." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken complexities. "It was one coffee," Meredith finally replied. "Colin teaches literature at the college. Nothing serious." "That's not." Neil paused, collecting his thoughts. "I'm not checking up on you, Meredith. You're free to date whoever you want." "Then why the call?" she asked, confusion evident. Neil considered his motivation, surprised to discover it was genuine concern rather than possessiveness or lingering resentment. "After everything with Preston, I just want to make sure you're being careful. Taking things slowly." Another silence, this one softer. I am, Meredith finally said. Therapy has helped me understand why I was vulnerable to someone like Preston. Why I was looking for that I wasn't getting a home. The implied criticism might once have triggered defensiveness in Neil. Now, he recognized the truth in it. We both made mistakes, he acknowledged. Different kinds, different magnitudes, but still. Are you happy, Neil? Meredith asked suddenly. With how everything turned out, the question deserved honest reflection. Neil thought about Phoenix Pinnacle's success, his reconnection with Amber, the newfound respect he'd earned in the business community. But happiness? That remained elusive. I'm content, he finally answered. Fulfilled professionally. Healing personally. Happiness seems like a high bar at this point. For what it's worth, Meredith said softly, I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Not the way it happened, but the result. You become more yourself somehow. The man I always knew you could be, just not in the way either of us expected. The comment was surprisingly insightful, touching on something Neil had felt but not articulated. The betrayal had forced him to reclaim parts of himself that had been subordinated to career advancement, to suburban conformity, to the predictable patterns of their marriage. Thank you, Neil replied, genuinely appreciative of her perception. I should let you go. I just wanted to. He trailed off, uncertain how to explain an impulse he didn't fully understand himself. I know, Meredith said. Sunday coffee still on? Of course, Neil confirmed before ending the call. Later that night, unable to sleep, Neil found himself driving through Oak Ridge, eventually parking outside Bellissimo, the restaurant where Preston had taken Meredith that fateful night, the first domino in the cascade that had transformed all their lives. Neil had never been inside since that discovery, avoiding it as a symbol of their broken marriage. Tonight, on impulse, he entered and requested a table, observing the elegant decor that had once impressed Meredith. The maitre d' recognized him. Neil's face had been in the business section frequently since the merger announcement. Mr. Reeves, an honor to have you with us. Your usual table. Neil was about to correct him, explain he'd only dined here once years ago, when he realized the man was confusing him with Preston, who had apparently become a regular. The irony was striking. Actually, Neil replied, I'll sit at the bar. From his bar stool, Neil observed the restaurant's wealthy patrons, the social ritual of fine dining that Preston had used to seduce Meredith. He ordered a bourbon, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment of strange closure. The revenge that had driven him was complete. Preston Walsh was professionally destroyed, his reputation in tatters. Last Neil had heard, Preston had moved to another state, starting over in a diminished capacity at a much smaller firm. Meredith had faced the consequences of her choices, the public humiliation, the fear of Preston's true nature, the dissolution of her marriage. Both had paid prices commensurate with their betrayals. Yet sitting here, in the place where their affair had blossomed, Neil felt no triumph, no vindication, only a weary recognition that revenge, while satisfying in execution, left little nourishment in its aftermath. His phone buzzed with a text from Samuel. Final acquisition paperwork filed today. Phillips cleared out his office. It's officially Phoenix Pinnacle now. Neil read the message, acknowledging the milestone it represented. The professional revenge was complete. He had not only recovered from Preston's attempt to destroy his career, but had surpassed his former position, now controlling the very company that had once discarded him. As Neil finished his bourbon, another text arrived, this one from Amber. Just got my acceptance letter from State. First choice business program. Can I call you? Neil smiled, genuine warmth spreading through him as he stepped outside to take his daughter's call. Her excited voice, the future plans she eagerly shared, her request that he help her tell Meredith the news. These were the rebuilding blocks of a life beyond revenge. After the call, Neil returned to his apartment, his thoughts clearer than they had been in months. The revenge that had consumed him had served its purpose, not just punishing those who had wronged him, but forcing him to reclaim his power, to rebuild himself stronger than before. The final piece of his transformation wasn't professional success or even the rebuilt relationship with Amber. It was forgiveness, not for Meredith's sake or even Preston's, but for his own. Not forgetting, not excusing, but releasing the corrosive hold that betrayal had maintained on his spirit. Sunday morning arrived clear and crisp. Neil arrived at Riverside Park early, securing their usual bench overlooking the water. Meredith appeared precisely at 10, carrying 2 coffees. She had started bringing his preferred dark roast weeks ago, a small gesture of attention that Neil appreciated. "Congratulations on finalizing the acquisition," Meredith said as she sat beside him, passing him his coffee. "Thank you," Neil replied. "Amber told you about her acceptance?" Meredith nodded, pride evident. "She called last night. She's thrilled that you're helping with the business program scholarship applications." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching ducks navigate the river currents. It was Meredith who finally broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "I saw Preston's name in the real estate transfers last week," she mentioned casually. "He sold his condo. I heard he took a position in Charlotte," Neil replied, equally casual. "Junior account manager at a regional firm." Neither took satisfaction in Preston's downfall. It was simply information to be acknowledged, part of the closing of that chapter. "Do you ever wonder," Meredith asked hesitantly, "what would have happened if you hadn't overheard Amber and me that day? If you had confronted us directly instead of everything that followed?" Neil considered the question seriously. "I would have been devastated either way," he finally answered. "But I wouldn't have discovered what I was capable of, professionally or personally. It was never just about revenge, Meredith. It was about reclaiming myself." Meredith nodded, understanding dawning in her expression. "You're different now. Stronger. More authentically Neil." "We're all different," Neil acknowledged. "You, me, Amber. What happened changed us fundamentally." "For the better?" Meredith asked, vulnerability evident in the question. Neil thought about Phoenix Pinnacle's success, his deepening relationship with Amber, the self-knowledge he'd gained through therapy. Even his relationship with Meredith had evolved into something more honest, if not romantic. "For the different," he finally replied. "Better in some ways, harder in others. But yes, ultimately better." As they continued their conversation, discussing Amber's college plans, Meredith's teaching position, the house she was selling, Neil realized that the revenge that had once consumed his every waking thought had transformed into something unexpected, a path to genuine healing. The Neil Reeves who had stood frozen in that doorway, devastated by betrayal, was gone. The man who had executed a plan of professional and personal retribution was likewise fading. In their place stood someone new, a man who had faced darkness, both external and within himself, and emerged not untouched but unbroken. Not a victim, not an avenger. Simply Neil, authentic, resilient, finally ready to build rather than destroy. When Meredith departed with a casual wave rather than their former awkward goodbye, Neil remained on the bench, contemplating the river's constant flow, always changing, always the same. A fitting metaphor for his transformation. His phone buzzed with a text from Samuel. Monday leadership meeting agenda prepared. First official day as Phoenix Pinnacle. New beginning. Neil smiled at the phrase. New beginning. From the ashes of betrayal and the fires of revenge, something unexpected had emerged. Not the life he had planned, but perhaps the life he was meant to have all along. Phoenix Rising, indeed. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.